A month ago, if you had asked me what I thought about Godot, I probably would have laughed. From what I knew, it was this tiny bare bones engine that people use because
It's open source and completely free to use.
God, the number of times I've heard that about Godot. I figured it was basically the game engine equivalent of Pygame, fine for simple projects but nothing I'd take seriously. I'd spent years using Unity, and despite all of Unity's problems and clunkiness, I couldn't imagine switching. However, as the title suggests, that quickly changed. I had a conversation with a friend who I learned also made games, which just was exciting news because I'd honestly never had somebody in my life who shared that hobby, and as we talked more, she mentioned she'd use Godot. At first this made me laugh because who would use Godot over Unity's superiority? But eventually the conversation turned to the upcoming Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam, and we decided it'd be fun to enter as a team. I didn't want to make her switch to Unity, especially since I was getting a little annoyed with the clunkiness and the C#, so I figured I'd give Godot a chance, especially since I know Python pretty well considering I've spent multiple classes learning Python basics. So my plan was simple, spend a week learning the basics, see if it was as limited as I thought it was, and if I hated it, I could go back to Unity and enter the game jam myself. In our nerdy conversation, she told me about another event that she was going to join, the 2D Game Jam #Reborn. It seemed like the perfect excuse to learn the engine before the Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam. I thought it'd take me a week to get comfortable with Godot, yet instead it completely changed how I think about making games. I started where I think almost everyone starts when they decide to learn Godot. Bracky's beginner tutorial. I really like this tutorial because it doesn't try to teach you everything. It just focuses on the fundamentals. You learn how to move a player, detect collisions, use area 2Ds, build simple enemies, collect coins, and more importantly, how those individual pieces connect. It reminds me a lot of Mark Brown's Unity Flappy Bird tutorial, which is a tutorial I still swear by. It doesn't teach you how to make the next big indie game, it teaches you enough of the fundamentals that you can start experimenting and figuring things out. After I finished the tutorial, I felt like I was ready for the game jam that my friend was talking about, and I figured what better way to learn Godot than join a game jam. When the theme was announced, it was Invisible, with the sub-theme, You Are the Enemy. I started brainstorming ideas, and eventually I landed on one that only a true psychopath could come up with. You play as an addict, breaking into a hospital. Your goal is to avoid the doctors, sneak through the building, and destroy the cure for cancer. Why the cure for cancer? Because apparently the cure for cancer removes your ability to turn invisible. You're able to become invisible because you took those special pills and give you the ability, and stopping cancer is something only an enemy would do. I realize now that maybe I was the one on pills, just not the invisibility kind. As crazy of an idea as it was, it actually made a lot of sense from a beginner's perspective. Almost every mechanic was something I had learned from the tutorial. The pills work like the coins, the vision coins were just area 2Ds, player movement was already solved, I just needed to make it a vector instead of 1 and -1. The only thing that would have been a little bit more difficult was the doctor AI and the pathfinding. I got the doctor to chase the player by getting a reference directly to the player, which was something I didn't like, but it worked and was a simple solution. I realize now that I could have used get first node and group, but this was what I knew then. The next most difficult part was figuring out how the entire game depended on one mechanic.
Invisibility.
So I had a new problem. How does the doctor's vision cone know whether the player is invisible? Coming from a beginner in Unity, my first instinct was simple. I would just grab a reference to the player script, find the boolean is invisible, and check that on and off, and if it's on, don't start chasing the player. If it's off, do start. Except that's not how it works in Godot. This might have been the most difficult part about learning Godot. The way the game engine solves problems is different. My solution for this in Godot was a global script. Whenever the player became invisible, I would update a global variable. Then the vision cone could check that variable and decide whether it should detect the player. And it worked. Looking back, this might have been my first introduction to my biggest struggle throughout the entire month. Just because something works doesn't mean it's the right solution. My global script basically felt like a band-aid. It solved the immediate problem, but now anything in the game could access the player's invisibility state, whether it actually needed to or not. A better solution probably would have been using signals passing information through the area 2D, or designing the systems differently. Either way, after I got that to work, the rest of the game came along pretty nicely. However, as assets were starting to get added, the second major lesson came near the end of the jam. Mechanically, my invisibility worked. The player really was invincible, but it didn't feel like they were. What I wanted to do was change the player's transparency, but me being me, not reading the docs or figuring it out, I decided to make a bunch of different invisibility sprites. This worked, but it was yet again another band-aid. The problem wasn't that I didn't know how to make the player look invisible, the problem was I didn't have a good way to represent the player's state. I was solving problems by adding more things instead of improving the systems underneath. A proper state machine would have made this much cleaner. A simple invisible state could control the animation, visuals, and behavior instead of me adding more if statements. Either way, by the end of the jam, I finished my first Godot game. There was no ranking. They were saying that the ranking system was bugged, but either way, it was finished and out. And honestly, I walked away with a different lesson than I expected out of this jam. I thought I was going to learn Godot. I learned that there wasn't a lot that I didn't know. As I scrolled YouTube more and more, I learned I needed composition, decoupling, different nodes. I wanted to learn good architecture and how to make a game that's easy to change. Those lessons would be the foundation for my next project. This is where I had to hit rock bottom before I could rise again. Coming off the game jam, I felt confident. I had just finished my first Godot game, learned a lot, and thought I was ready to start working on the game I wanted to make from the beginning. A bullet hell boss rush. My idea and initial concept was simple. I wouldn't build the whole game at once, I'd start with one boss, slowly build out the mechanics, and eventually have the foundation for my dream game. On paper, that sounds like the right approach, like a ton of small games like everyone says to make. And everything was going well to start off. I started separating my systems into different components. Inputs lived in one script, movement in another, and health was its own component. Compared to my game jam project, this already felt much cleaner. Then I easily added a gun. The player could shoot bullets on a timer. The bullets damaged enemies. Suddenly I had my first combat mechanic. Next came the dash. This time I remembered one of the lessons from the game jam. Instead of making a bunch of different sprites, I simply lowered the player's alpha value while dashing so they looked intangible. Then to make the player actually have invincibility frames, I learned I could change the collision mask while dashing so the player would temporarily ignore enemy projectiles. It was a much cleaner solution than anything I'd done before, which taught me what I could have done for the invisibility in my game. Then I finally started building the boss I'd been looking forward to the whole time, Seraphine. She started simple, an idle state and a firing state. She would shoot fireballs at the player, and eventually I wanted her to create walls of fire that forced you to move around. This was also my first real attempt at using state machines and the animation player, and I felt like I was finally starting to write code the right way. Until very quickly it became not the right way. Everything really started breaking. My components that I thought would work across multiple scenes weren't. Everything started to break another. Before I knew it, I was right back where I started. The code worked, but it wasn't built to grow. I started asking questions outside of the basics and more on my side of the game. For a while, I thought my mistake was choosing too ambitious of a project. I convinced myself I needed to make smaller games before I could make my dream game. I would scroll on YouTube watching one game dev video after the next until I found one that actually resonated with me. This was the foundation of my problem. I wasn't just using components as building blocks. I was stacking more and more on, trying to call it a small game. That's when it finally clicked. I didn't need to make smaller games. I needed to build a small system, master one thing, and make it the best it is. After shelving the boss fight project, I somehow ended up right back where I started the month. Bracky's Godot tutorial. The difference was This time I wasn't following it, I was using it as a foundation. Really, I just needed the assets and animations. I wasn't interested in trying to force myself to rebuild the tutorial. I wanted to see how far I could push one system if I stopped worried about making the entire game. So I decided to build a player movement system. This time I also really focused on my architecture and approached it differently. I was still able to add components, except this time I had them work differently. The player's character body acted as the orchestrator between them. I stopped focusing on components that would work across scenes and focused on one that would work across any future 2D movement game. And so it started the same as Brachy's, left, right, jump, but then I wanted to make this even better, literally obsessed over the system. Instantly changing directions worked, but it didn't feel natural. I was able to add acceleration and made the player build momentum, while friction gave a stopping sense of weight. Then I moved on to the jump function, and this is where we're able to add a lot of juice. The jump technically worked, but it felt very floaty, so I increased the gravity while the player was falling. The jump height stayed the same, but falling became much faster, making the movement feel more responsive. Instead of chasing new mechanics, I was polishing the same one. That became the theme of the entire project. Once the movement felt solid, I brought back state machines. Considering that this is where my boss fight game broke, I wanted to really focus on it. It was a lot simpler now that I understood it more and was ready to make a jump state, an idle state, and a movement state. Each state had one responsibility: play the correct animation and decide when to transition, nothing more. They all referenced the movement component, and while I knew there was still some coupling there, it was intentional and much easier to reason than what I'd built before. This is where I started flowing. I started adding little things like coyote time, jump buffering, variable jump height. Before this project, I always thought these mechanics were just fancy tricks no one ever notices. Players should just jump correctly. After implementing them though, I realized how much juice they really add and how they make the player feel smarter than they actually are. None of these things changed how the game worked, but they changed how the game felt, and it was amazing. I felt like I was finally learning after the past month I had spent. I didn't spend this time on this project making a platformer, I spent it making movement. Every improvement taught me something new about architecture, game feel, player feedback, and polishing a mechanic instead of abandoning it for the next feature. And for the first time, I was honestly enjoying the process of making one system as good as I possibly could, and I learned more doing that than I had trying to build an entire boss rush game. When I started this month, I thought learning Godot meant learning a new engine. I thought I would spend a week learning the nodes, figuring out GD script, learning where everything was, and then I'd be ready to make my dream game. Looking back, the engine itself was probably the easiest part. The game jam taught me that I wasn't just learning a new tool, I was learning a different way to think about making games. I kept running into problems where I knew how I would have solved them in Unity, but Godot forced me to actually understand the problem instead of recreating the solution I already knew. The boss fight project was probably the biggest turning point. I spent so much time thinking I needed to make smaller games before I could make the game I actually wanted to make. But that wasn't the problem. Movement, combat, AI, bosses, architecture. I was building an entire game while still trying to understand the individual pieces that made it work. I didn't need smaller games, I needed smaller systems. And the platform project showed me that sometimes the fastest way to improve is to slow down. Instead of chasing the next mechanic, I spent the time making one system as good as I could. Learn more from polishing movement than I did from adding another unfinished feature to the prototype. I think that's something a lot of learn game development videos don't really explain. I understand that making small games is important. If I hadn't joined the game jam, I already would have been way behind than I am now. But eventually you end up hitting a wall, and getting past that wall isn't about making more games using the same tutorial prototype that you know. It's about understanding the systems underneath. So did I learn Godot in 1 month? Depending on how you define learning Godot, I think I did a good job. But there were a lot of bigger things I learned. How to actually learn game development, how to take tutorials and use them for your project, and that good architecture actually matters. I think the biggest thing I learned though was Godot isn't the bare bones engine I thought it was. Godot is an engine with a ton of potential, and more importantly, it's an engine that changed the way I approach making games. I know I still have a lot to learn. I'm still going to write bad code, make mistakes, and probably rebuild systems that I thought were finished. But a month ago, I thought Godot was just some free engine that I would never seriously use. And now, it's the engine I'm going to continue using for the games I want to make. So how did this month of learning help me in the GMTK game jam? Well, it started off with
Psych! That's the wrong number!
I'm just kidding. You're gonna have to wait until the next video. But thank you for joining me in my story.